Hello, this is section 2 of my series of recordings on experientialism, which is my own homegrown epistemology. In this section, I'm going to discuss the practical guides to epistemology that we can draw from the presuppositions that I arrived at in the previous section. Experientialism, when practically applied, is somewhat similar to empiricism, but important in different ways as well. Where empiricism says that all knowledge must be derived from the senses, which opens it up to attacks such as the fact that that statement itself is not something that can be derived from the senses. Experientialism, meanwhile, says that all knowledge about the envelope must be derived ultimately from the senses, but knowledge concerning other things, including knowledge itself, which is a subset of the mind, can be derived from other sources, as you probably noticed in the previous section. Let me put it this way. As I said in the previous section, our only connection to the envelope is through our senses. So if we want to understand the envelope, we must use our senses. However, our connection to ourselves and our own minds is much more immediate. We are essentially identical to our own minds. So introspection is all that is truly necessary for understanding and having knowledge about our own minds, which includes having knowledge about how we gain knowledge, which is an action of our minds. Now, the best ways to come to understandings through introspection is to search for things that are self-evident, that are performatively basic, which is often the same thing, or things that are essentially immediate to our minds. We can often use reason inside our minds to understand those things, using what I call meta-justification, which is covered in section 1a. Now, how do we actually go about using our senses to understand the envelope? Well, there's really 3 parts to this. The first part is understanding the necessary properties that our senses must hold or satisfy in order to make sense to us. And this doesn't tell us much about the envelope, but it does tell us how the envelope must manifest to us. Then you have the second part, which is how best to derive, provisionally of course, interpretations of what our senses mean about the ontological structure of the envelope. And then we have the third part, which is how best to use those interpretations in order to generate new interpretations concerning the ontological structure of the envelope. The first part is somewhat like phenomenology, the second part is somewhat like empiricism, and the third part is somewhat like rationalism. So as you will see, experientialism adeptly encompasses what I believe to be the best and most useful parts of all of the other philosophies. Now, I'm going to be using the word useful a lot, so I think I should explain why I use it and why it matters before I move on. Now, one thing that is impossible to deny is that we desire happiness in some sense, or at least the avoidance of pain, or unhappiness or unfulfillment. And our senses are things that we can't actually get rid of and separate from ourselves, since our senses are what allow us to be conscious and therefore exist in the first place. And those senses, of course, affect our experiences, our level of pleasure or pain, happiness or unhappiness, fulfillment or unfulfillment. And, of course, the envelope affects our senses. Now, we can also affect the envelope, but in order to affect the envelope, we need to act. And in order to act, we need to be able to predict what our actions will do in the envelope. So, in the end, it boils down to the fact that if we desire to influence our own state of happiness or unhappiness, then we must learn how to predict the envelope. And to predict something, we need to at least attempt to understand its ontological nature. This is what I mean by usefulness. Something that is useful is something that allows us to achieve the goal that we desire, which is happiness and the avoiding of unhappiness. And so something that is useful is something that will allow us to understand the ontological structure of the envelope and therefore to predict it. Now, I believe that understanding how the envelope must necessarily manifest to us is actually useful, even though it does not necessarily have a direct connection to the ontological structure of the envelope. Because, once again, we only experience the envelope through our own conceptualizations and sense experiences, and therefore, if there are certain limits to those conceptualizations and sense experiences, then those limits limit how the envelope can affect us and how it can appear to us. So, from our perspective, since there is no perspective outside of us and no direct connection to the envelope, ontologically speaking, that is not mediated by the senses, if there's a limit to how the envelope can present itself to us, then that is a limit on what the envelope is, as far as we can ever tell. So, let's begin with that first part then. The first part is examining how the envelope must present itself to us because of how our minds and senses function. So let's begin with objects. We recognize something as a singular object, even though we can move it or change it slightly or break it or set it aside and come back later or any number of things. And the reason why this is because when we see an object, we essentially derive certain, a cluster of sense experiences from it. For instance, looking at the model on my shelf right now, it's blue and red and yellow and white, 2 different tones of white. And it has a certain shape and a certain sheen to it and a certain size and so on. And so my brain takes these cluster of sensations in a sort of heuristic pattern and assigns that to a singular object, and I can give it a name. Importantly, however, it does not expect the exact same cluster of sensations every time. Instead, it's a heuristic algorithm dependent on the sense experiences, the cluster of senses all falling within a certain set of ranges. So I expect a certain range of like a certain amount of red from it and so on. This is why we are able to predict what something will look like from the back. And so we essentially take this set of ranges, these expectations that we derive from the sense cluster, and project them onto the rear of the object, while applying any hints about what the rear of the object might look like that we can get from the front of the object, or the side of the object, or whatever it may be. Now, however, is an interesting thing. If we see an object that falls completely out of the range, if, for instance, I looked away and looked back and the entire model was red, I would think that it was a different object, that the object had been replaced. However, we often recognize in day-to-day life things that change drastically over time. How is this possible? Well, each individual change, each time we see the object, is gradual. It falls within the range. It just moves each property towards the edge of its range. And then when we see the object, we adjust where the center of those ranges are so that the new property falls at the midpoint of those ranges. And then the next time we see the object, then it will have changed, but will still fall in those ranges, and we adjust the ranges. What happens when we do not recognize an object is that it has taken a single jump outside the range and hasn't given us time to adjust our range of expectations. Whereas something that changes drastically over time, as long as we see it regularly enough, and as long as each time we see it, it falls within the expected range, then there's time for our ranges to adjust, and we will understand it as the same thing. So why do we call this set of sense perceptions a single object? Well, it is essentially a process of non-precising abstraction. We take a specific instance, remove some details which we don't find useful to specify, make some details a range, and specify some details. And then we keep that template and not the object itself in our minds. And when we see something that can match that template, then we call it the same thing. We can do this multiple times too. We can have multiple different objects, and then we can form a template from those objects by removing some details that are or by taking some details that are common to each object, or some ranges that are common to each object, and making them a smaller template, which we call a concept. That's the process of abstraction, is essentially detail elision. Now, what objects we choose to abstract from and what details we choose to keep essentially boils down to what is convenient for communication, what is convenient for thought, and what allows us to best predict the ontological structure of these objects as they appear in the envelope. This has interesting implications for the nature of what we must see in order to understand the senses that we are getting from the envelope. Essentially, the idea that an object must fall within a certain range to be recognized as the same object can be called the law of relative identity. It's essentially the law of identity, but adapted for areas in which there can be nuance and changes in conditions and context. And essentially, the envelope, as it presents itself to us, can never, ever break the law of relative identity. If it does, if the same object transforms immediately out of the range that we expect from the object, we just view it as a different object with its own template and therefore its own relative identity. We don't see it as the same object that has violated our relative identity. And to perceive an object at all, it must be capable of satisfying the relative identity. It must have some properties and not have others to allow us to differentiate it. This means that as a corollary, we must have the law of relative non-contradiction. And we can gain empiricism from this quite simply. Essentially, the way that we do this is that we say that we must prioritize being able to predict the envelope in order to act and therefore live and therefore improve our internal states. And if the past is like the future, which is one of the presuppositions, the subsidiary presuppositions, the prima facie validity of induction, then if there is little sense experience to indicate that something was true in the past, then there will likely be little sense experience to indicate that it is true in the future, and therefore it will not affect us as much as if it were true, and therefore we should weigh it as less likely to be true or less certainly true. And the more sense experiences in the past indicated to us that something was true, then the more sense experiences in the future will indicate to us that it is true, and so we should weigh it more heavily. So this gives us the rule that we should apportion our level of certainty to the amount of sense evidence. And this can work for concepts too. If we find that something is true of all things that fall under a certain abstract concept, then we can expect in the future for anything that satisfies the criteria to become an object that falls under that concept to also have those things be true of it. And of course, we can get the scientific method from this very simply by saying that since prediction is very important, what we should do is try to take the simplest set of concepts that we can derive from a set of sense experiences, where concepts can include patterns of behavior and not just direct, singular, picture-like sense experiences. And we should try to derive predictions from these sets of simplest possible concepts, and then see if these predictions are true. And if these predictions are often true, then we can expect the predictions to be often true in the future, and therefore we can expect that set of simplest possible concepts to be very useful in the future, and so we should act on it. And since the most that we care about the envelope is how it affects us and how we can affect it through prediction, then we should essentially treat something that is very predictive as the most amount of truth that we can derive from the envelope. Likewise, we should attempt to derive the simplest possible set of concepts from sense experiences in order to generate predictions, because we want to make as few assumptions about the ontological nature of the envelope as possible, and we want to most directly predict the things that we want without accidentally making other predictions that might be wrong because they are not supported by as much additional sense experience. For instance, if I make extra concepts, the more concepts I make, the less the higher concepts or the peripheral concepts will be directly supported by the sense experience, and so I would need more sense experience to support them directly. However, if I don't have that sense experience, but the very presence of those concepts makes other predictions, then it is more likely that those predictions will be wrong, and therefore it is more likely that a system of concepts that makes more concepts than necessary will make incorrect predictions and therefore not only be not useful, but be actively detrimental. This is actually where we get into some of the more interesting things. Because if we take the idea that we can abstract out concepts from our sense experience, and then those abstractions can actually be abstractions of patterns of sense experiences instead of particular picture-like sense experiences, then we can see how we get mathematics. People are often left in awe about how effective mathematics is in describing our world, but I am hardly surprised by this. And I almost find it funny when people are so surprised. Because mathematics is essentially a set of concepts that we have derived from all of human experience, both each individual experience and the experience of the whole species through the communication that we have, concerning discrete objects, or objects in general, and the patterns of behavior that they have when interacting. Mathematics is, in essence, based on the most and longest running, the most empirical possible basis. It is essentially based on the longest running experiment, the longest running collection of evidence that we've ever made. So the fact that it can predict and describe our reality quite well is unsurprising when it was designed, created for that very purpose, and when it was done by the very method that is most effective at doing that. This is borne out by the fact that math is not something that we are handed down from on high. We have changed the fundamental axioms of mathematics. Often, we have inspected, rejected, revised, and rebuilt mathematics when we have found that it doesn't actually match how things should work in our sense experience. This is likewise true for the various kinds of logic that build on the relative law of identity and the relative law of non-contradiction, including classical logic, fuzzy logic, and so on. These are all man-made things that we've made in order to serve certain purposes in describing our grand sense experiences. This is why I do not think that we should be very quickly dismissive of deduction from certain empirical premises to other empirical conclusions. Since the deduction is often viewed as anti-empirical, it is often the case that people that are very empirical scoff at it. However, since logic and mathematics is perhaps the most empirical system that we have, we should not balk in using it in order to further understand the other empirical sense experiences that we have. However, we should always return to the wellspring of sense experience, the envelope itself, or at least our sense experiences of it, to check such deductions, since it is possible for us to make mistakes, whereas what ultimately matters is the envelope itself. To sum up, empiricism can be easily derived from the facts about how we can gain knowledge about the envelope and why we care about the envelope, and rationalism can be derived partly from that empiricism. So, in conclusion, though, I would like to describe how I view what our procedure should be for choosing among these different ways of knowing. We should begin with introspection if we desire to understand something about the processes of our own minds. We should then go to empiricism first if we want to understand the envelope. And then, if the scientific method, which is a subset of empiricism, is unavailable, for instance, we can't repeat some experiment, or it's difficult to make predictions, then we should move on to rationalism, which is actually quite empiricist, as I have shown, but is still opens us up for more mistakes than we might have made otherwise.